Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Book 2 of his work on anger, Seneca is going to talk about what gets translated as child rearing, and actually that's a decent translation. The term, which should be familiar to you because it's a cognate for one of our English words, is educatio. And, there wasn't a system of public education at the time. And a lot of the education that people are getting is coming within the home. So it does make sense to think about this in terms of how to raise your own children. And the idea here is, how can you raise children to not be angry people, to not foster that vice within them? And he talks about this first in the very short chapter 18, saying that so we can avoid anger, I'm going to offer some prescriptions that pertain to our way of life as a whole. These I will distribute between child rearing and the time that follows. So prescriptions, ideas that we can actually apply. Some of them apply to children, some of them apply to the time after childhood, when we've already got some habits established, probably not the best habits. We're going to put those to the side. So what can you do for your kids? He says that child rearing requires the greatest attention, but it also has the greatest payoff. Why? Well, you're working with young minds that aren't already firmly established. He says it's easy to set minds in good order while they're still tender, still malleable, but it's difficult to prune away vices that have grown up with us. They become our habits. So if we want our children to do better, we want to pay attention to this. And then he goes on and talks about temperaments. We've already discussed that elsewhere, so I'm going to skip over that and jump right into his lengthy chapter 21, where he does give us a number of different pretty useful precepts for how to raise children who, it's not that they won't ever be angry, but at least they won't be angry people. They'll have some control over it. And he says there's a difficulty right from the start that he's going to explore a bit. He says that it's difficult to steer the right course. Why? Because, and by the way, right course is regimen, the word that we get regimen from, right? The right approach to things. Why? Because we have to avoid nurturing anger in the children, but we also want to avoid blunting their natural capacities. So there is a sort of energy that comes from anger that perhaps they will need or lapse into from time to time, but we need to be careful about this. So he says, the thing you're trying to encourage and the thing you're trying to repress, being energetic and being angry, being gripped by anger, are nurtured by similar things. They're fed by similar things, but similar things easily deceive even an attentive observer. So, for example, license makes the spirit grow. License means being indulged in things. So when we talk about a kid being spoiled, being given things on, as we say, a silver platter or having a silver spoon in their mouth, right? That's an example of license. And if you do that, well, the kids think that they're, deserving of it. They become entitled. Servility, which is the opposite extreme, being told that, well, you don't really matter, you're lower. For example, to be told children should be seen and not heard. Well, that sends you a message, and a message of servility. So we want to avoid either of these extremes, he says. And he says, the spirit gets elated, raised up when praised, and comes to form good expectations of itself. That's not a bad thing. You want children to have what we nowadays call good self-esteem or healthy self-esteem. But coming from the same place, arrogance and anger. So we really have to be paying close attention. So he says, well, what we have to do is steer a middle course, inter utrumque. So go between either one of these. And he says sometimes we need the spurs, sometimes we need the reins. This is an equestrian or horsemanship metaphor. And it's interesting that one of the terms that's used here, frenum, means, in ancient Latin, it means something like the reins that you would pull back on for a horse. So you don't want them to go too fast, right? Or you want them to stop. That's actually a word that comes to mean brakes in other languages. For example, in French, frein means brakes, right? So sometimes we need to urge them to have more energy. Sometimes we need to hold them back. And now he gives you some more useful advice, right? So he says, let the child's spirit suffer nothing abject, nothing worthy of a slave. So don't, push your children down, make them totally dependent upon you. Don't make them jump through unnecessary hoops. Don't humiliate them for the sake of humiliating them. Don't say, ooh, you're getting too big for your britches, when they're actually not. And see that they never have to beg and wheedle. Now, what is begging? Begging and bargaining. You could say, well, if I do this, will you give me this? If I'm a good boy, will you let me have this thing over here? Be a good boy, and then we'll see about it, right? So he says that we don't want the child to get his way by doing so. Instead, grant what the child wants for 3 reasons, 3 good reasons, which will mean sometimes saying, actually, I don't have a good reason. One would be for the child's own sake. You're like, well, yeah, this is something that you need. So, for example, here in America, every beginning of the school year, children go shopping for school supplies. If you're, stretched for money, maybe you have to say no about things. The kid wants the nice backpack, and you're like, listen, you're going to have this backpack. But it's better than no backpack at all, Or you don't get the crayons, you don't get the 64 crayon set. You're going to have to, do with the, I don't know what they come in now, 12 crayon boxes. You're going to have to use the boxes of the school. But sometimes you can say, okay, you do deserve this. And it could be also based on their past behavior, right? Or it could be good behavior that's promised for the future. If you've got a good reason to think that they will in fact behave well in the future, you are granting that to them reasonably, right? So that's not going to provoke a sense of entitlement. He also talks about another thing that I think is really quite interesting. A child also needs to learn how to compete, contendere, to be in competition with other people for things, because that's going to be part of their life, right? Unless they're extraordinarily lucky. So he says, when he's competing with his fellows, allow him neither to be bested, to be beaten down and humiliated, nor to become angry. We should make an effort to ensure he regularly competes with friends so that he becomes accustomed, now notice this, to wanting to win. That is, that's the point of competing, to win, right? But not to hurt the other person. To see winning as a good thing, but not at the expense of cheating, hurting the other person, lying, maybe even damaging them in particular ways. So we don't want them to desire to do harm. Whenever he comes out on top and has done something praiseworthy, we should allow him to be elated, but not to strut, not to brag about it, not to go too far. Joy is succeeded by exaltation, which in turn, he says, is followed by a big head and too high an opinion of oneself. So learning how to put things into perspective. It's great if you run a race and you come in first, or even you place within the first three. That's wonderful, but that's only a race, right? It's great if your grades are as high as they can be, or you take an entrance exam and you score very highly. That's awesome, but that doesn't mean that you're better than everybody else in all the other respects, right? So it's very important to give the child a sense of proportion and perspective when they are competing. Now, another thing that I think perhaps is a big deal in American culture, and perhaps other cultures as well, and it's not just a rich people thing, because this can also happen with middle class and poor people as well, is not letting the child engage in sloth and inactivity and keeping them clear of luxuries. Seneca says, nothing makes people more inclined to anger than being brought up soft and spoiled. Now, it's interesting if we pause here. Seneca himself is a rich man, and he engages with plenty of other rich people, including an emperor who he was the tutor of, and got to see being, indulged in all sorts of luxuries. And so presumably this is coming from some reflection on experience, but I think we could think about it as well. All of us have had classmates who were indulged in all sorts of ways, where we're like, whoa, what's that like? We don't have that at our place. You don't have to do chores at all, So he goes on and he says, the more an only child is indulged, the more license one's wards are given, the more corrupt their minds become. The person who's never been told no, whose anxious mother always wiped away his tears, whose attendant was beaten at his say-so, that person will not withstand being offended. So if we want people to have not a super thick skin, but at least enough of a skin that's not thin so that every little thing bothers them, well, they need to get used to doing chores. They need to get used to having people say no to them. They need to get used to not having all sorts of luxuries so they won't be soft and spoiled, right? He talks about how this affects adults as well. He goes on and he says we should actually tell children the truth and avoid flattery. So, doesn't mean that we have to be jerks about it, but we should, if a child is doing something and it's good, but it's not great, we don't have to tell them it's great. We don't have to give them a gold star at every occasion so that they feel fulfilled. And we should, as he's going to say a little bit later, allow scolding them for shortcomings. When they screw up, let them know that. You don't have to get angry yourself and beat them or denigrate them. But, if they fail in some way, you can say, hey, man, you're screwing up. What's going on there, buddy? Right? And that is actually good for them, Seneca will say, in terms of not, raising people who are going to be prone to anger. He also talks about feeling fear and respect for elders. He talks about rising before elders. This is a custom that I think a lot of people have kind of left out. Older people come in the room, you stand up. The sirring and mamming of people perhaps would be along these lines. By that I mean the American custom that tends to be associated either with people from the South or people in the military to use terms like sir or ma'am with people that you don't particularly know, or even just elders. Maybe there's something to that. And then he goes on and he talks about not allowing the child to get their way through anger. This is very, very important. And you can think about, examples of people being at the grocery store, the child throws a tantrum, they get the toy, or they get the thing that they shouldn't be eating or drinking because it's not healthy for them, and the parent gives in. What lesson is that actually teaching them? That anger, or something very closely related, crying, tears, will get them what it is that they want. And then they're going to go on and do it some more. It's not going to, that one incident is going to be a lesson that will lead to other incidents, and then we'll get a habit after a while. So he says, what has been refused to the weeping child should be given to him when he's calmed down. So it's not saying you deprive your children altogether, but you don't give it to them when they're throwing a tantrum. That's a terrible idea, right? You wait till they calm down and then you can talk to them. He also talks about the function of imitation of adults. So we have a huge impact on younger people, particularly those who we spend a lot of time with, and especially those who are our children. So he talks about, now of course this is like, something that rich people could afford, calm teachers and attendants, but we could think about the people that we entrust our children to. He says anything young and tender fastens itself to the things closest at hand and grows to resemble them. So he talks about this great example. A child raised at Plato's house was returned to his parents and saw his father shouting. He said, I never saw this at Plato's house. And then Seneca says, you know what? I bet that kid went on to imitate his dad more than Plato because it's his dad, right? So if you want your own children not to be gripped by anger, you probably need to get your own anger under control. And then he's going to conclude. Now, this is something he said a little bit earlier in the terms of the luxury, but I think it actually is a great connection to, we could call it equality or not thinking too much of yourself. He talks about wealth. Parents' wealth should be there to see, but not there to use. If you allow your kids to make use of your wealth, or it could be other things, your social status, to get special favors, to get things that their peers can't get, say to throw a party and everybody needs to be on their good side to get invited, you are raising a child in a way that is going to make them feel entitled to things that other people don't have. So he's going to go on and conclude this by saying, see that his food is simple, his clothing inexpensive, his mode of living like that of his fellows. So fellows here is equalibus, peers, people who are equal to us. Even if they don't have as much money, even if they don't have the same social status, even if they don't have the same power, they are still our equals. And he says, the child that you've made a peer of many from the start is not going to get angry when someone is compared with them. Now, by contrast, the child that you've been telling, oh, Junior, you're the best, you're so smart, you're wonderful, everybody should treat you as a special little snowflake, or pick whatever else you want, my precious little darling. Well, if you do that, then they think they are better than everybody else, and big surprise when they get angry when the world doesn't treat them that way because everybody else doesn't share your judgment of your precious little, pick whatever moniker you want. So this is some actual useful advice, I think, for raising children who would be less angry. All of it seems pretty on point, and you could imagine this as something almost like a program that you could put in place.